Next up on the stream, we have Eli Schutze. Eli Schutze is a front-end developer with Monzo, and in this talk, she's going to be talking about how internationalization is equal to accessibility. By opening up your apps to more users around the world, more people can take advantage of using them.
Hi everyone, my name is Ellie. I'm a web engineer at Monzo. You can find me on Twitter at EllieBelly, and I'm here to talk to you today about internationalization. Now, before we get started, I want to give you a little bit of my life story in emoji, which you'll see on screen. I'm not a narcissist, I promise. I have a point about this later. So I was born in Mexico. I grew up and am from Nicaragua. I went to university in the States for several years, during which I did an exchange term in China. And now, for the past 4.5 years, I've been living in London in the UK, which is where I am now, coming to you from my living room, staying safe. For those of you who were wondering, naturally, this is where Nicaragua is. It is a country in Central America. A lot of people ask me, so I just thought I would point that out. So let's talk about internationalization, particularly on the web. The first thing I want to cover, so that we're all on the same page, is that internationalization is often written on the internet as I-18N. Now, this is something called a numeronym, which is a number-based word. For example, numbers as sounds, like K9 from Police Dogs Unit, or later from texting. Numbers as meaning, 007, James Bond, 24/7, or 911. Adding up the number of letters between the first and last and then using that number instead of the middle of the word. Wow, what a good idea. I know, right? And this includes I-18N, L10N, which is localization, or you might have seen A11Y or ally, which stands for accessibility. And it's a really popular numeronym. Just as a bonus, this is the numeronym for numeronym. So when I was trying to figure out how to get everyone to care about internationalization, I went to my most trusted advisor to see if there was anything that could make it convincing for you that it was important. And I found these statistics, which are really interesting. Now, on the left, we have languages of websites, and on the right, we have internet users by language. Languages of websites, internet users by language. Now, you'll notice that languages of websites are about 52% English, followed in a far, far second by 6.6% Russian, German, Spanish, Japanese. Now, on the internet users, only about 26% are English speakers, a close second 20% Chinese speakers, and then Spanish, Arabic, Portuguese. You will notice that these two do not match, and that's where the problem comes in. Because websites aren't built for the users that are using them. And so the first thing I want to take away from this is that internationalization is part of accessibility. More and more people are coming online every day, and a lot of the times is not English speakers. Even in the UK, there's about 4.5 million non-English speakers. So even if your market is local, you're cutting people out by not internationalizing. I found this description online on the W3C standards website, and I thought it was really good to sum up what internationalization is. If you internationalize, you design or develop your content, application, specification, and so on in a way that can ensure it will work well for or can be easily adapted for users from any culture, region, or language. Now, there's two things here that are really important. One is the can be easily adapted for. Internationalization doesn't mean you go in to your site or your app or your docs and just translate all of them. It's building your code and your site in a way where you can adapt it maybe later, maybe now. The other part is the from any culture, region, or language. Internationalization is not just about translation. There's a lot of cultural and logistical factors you have to take in, and we'll talk about them later. Now, when you're building a site, you might do something like this. The most common way to start internationalizing is to make your strings be in a separate file. like a string resource. So instead of having a string hard-coded in your code, you start with a template or a placeholder, and you point it to a file with all the strings. That means that when it comes time to translate it, you can just point all of your templates to a different string file in a different language. This is what some of those files might look like. This is JSON, which I've used before, where you have an ID, which is the ID that you use, the developer, and then the text in the language of that file. And then you can refer to the string by ID in the code. Here's some example in handlebars, React, and just like vanilla JavaScript, where you can use an internationalization library, for example. Here is those examples just zoomed in a little bit in case you needed to get a better look. Now, what kinds of things do we need to think about when we think about internationalization? The first and the most obvious one is language, but not the only one. We also have writing system and line breaks. Not everyone uses ABCs. There's a lot of languages that have diacritics or different types of scripts. Formatting date, time, and currency. If anyone here is American or knows a lot of Americans, you'll know that this date is not what you think it is. Writing direction, not all languages are left to right or right to left, and sometimes you have to write text in both directions, and that's something to think about, especially with like Hebrew, Arabic. Ordering, pluralization. In Russian, for example, there's not just a singular and a plural. You need to use different words for like one thing, and then a different word for like 2 to 5 things, and then a different word for like 6 to like 11-ish things. So our assumptions about our own language are often not the same in other languages. Grammar and sentence structure, the order of like verbs and adjectives isn't always the same in different languages, and that catches a lot of developers when they try to string sentences together in code, but it might not always work. Relative time, like days ago, like when you do like a Facebook or a GitHub comment. And then bonus, there's also stuff about design and color theory. For example, different colors mean different things in different cultures, but I'm not going to get into that too much because that's more in the design. Now, so all of this we need to think about internationalization. Piece of cake, right? So I decided that yes, it's a piece of cake, but it's this giant, sparkly, rosette tower of a wedding cake. It's honestly not trivial to internationalize a site, but the stuff I'm going to tell you today will hopefully get you in a better place to understand how internationalization works, and give you the tools to at least learn more. So I made my own internationalization cake with all the layers for like standards and tools we can use to internationalize our site. And we're going to go through it. Just a note that the top 2 layers of my cake are optional because you can use different types of libraries, and I'm just going to talk about some that I know, but it's not all of them. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is Unicode. The Unicode Consortium gave us the Unicode encoding, UTF-8, or UTF-16, but UTF-8 is the most common one, and that's what allows us to do stuff like emoji or different characters from different languages without running out of space. The Unicode Consortium actually develops, extends, and promotes the use of the Unicode standard, but they're also in charge of a couple other technical committees that relate to internationalization. One is the CLDR, and one is the ICU, both of which we'll talk about in a second. And they're also in charge of the bidirectional text algorithm, which I'll talk about now. When you have text that is both right to left or left to right, the computer needs to know how to display it. So each character in the Unicode is either strongly or weakly typed with a direction, left to right or right to left, or neutral, so like an exclamation point. For example, this is the word Egypt in English and in Arabic. A letter like E, for example, will be strongly typed as left to right. And then Arabic script characters will be strongly typed as right to left. In HTML, you can set a base direction for your document, and the characters are displaced with reference to the parent's base direction. For example, there's a dir for direction attribute, and you can set it as left to right. So you'll see here you have 3 words, Bahrain, and then that's Egypt in Arabic, which I don't know how to say, and Kuwait. And because it's a left to right document, it'll show the words in the order left to right, but the second word will still be right to left. Now, if you set the direction as right to left, you can have the same content, but it will be displayed from right to left. You'll notice that the English words are still displayed as a left to right word, but the direction of the sentence changes. So here's a tip. If you are using bidirectional text, make sure that your HTML tags have a dir attribute to help out the Unicode algorithm display your text. Now, the next thing is that there's something I found out that exists called the Internet Engineering Task Force, which I think is so cool, and I kind of hope they look like this, but, you know, a girl can dream. And they publish these things called Best Common Practices, which are like standards. An important one here is BCP47, which describes tags for identifying locales. And what BCP47 says, that a locale tag is a combination of a language plus other subtags, which could be multiple. So for example, in my list here, we have EN, which is the language code for English, as spoken in the US versus EN English as spoken in GB, which is Great Britain. The importance of a locale is that sometimes we internationalize for a region, not necessarily for a language only. Obviously, the US and Great Britain have differences in date formats, have differences in spelling types, so it's important to make that distinction. The second example is Mongolian, as written in the Cyrillic character set, as spoken in Mongolia. The third is ZH, which is Chinese, in the traditional character set. Chinese has 2 different character sets, simplified and traditional, as spoken in Hong Kong, HK. And the last, ES, is Spanish, from the 419 region. So instead of specifying one country, 419 represents Latin America and the Caribbean as a whole region. So the BCP47 tags have different options for how to describe a region locale. Now, if you remember my very indulgent life story in emoji, here are what my locales would look like for each of these places. Now, if you were a web developer and I was visiting your site at any point in my life, what will you show me? How do you know what language do I speak? How do you know what I want to see your content in? So, if you take anything from this talk, let it be this. Always, always let the user pick their own locale. Always, every time. Just say it back to yourself. Always let the user choose their own locale. You can make an educated first guess, but always let the user pick their own, because you don't know their life situation. You don't know if they're traveling, if they're learning a language. You just don't know. Okay, moving on. One of the Unicode children, basically, is the Common Locale Data Repository, CLDR, which is, it's basically like 20 megabytes of XML files. And for each language, it has information in that language about how that language handles like names of the week, names of months, names of time zones. It's basically just like a repository of like locale related content that is fixed. There's info about like country names. Anyway, it's really fascinating. You can go on their website and download the whole thing if you ever want to just like peek in, although it's in XML, which is not very friendly. Here's an example of what the XML looks like. This is days of the week. This is the Spanish language in Spain file. And we have 3 forms: abbreviated, short, and wide. You'll notice that the type attribute in this XML doesn't change, so it's still Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, but the content changes based on the language. So, for example, in the wide section, Sunday is domingo. If you did want to play with it, there's a JSON version on GitHub, which is a little more friendly, especially to web developers. The CLDR is something that exists, but developers don't really interact with it that much. It's usually wrapped by like a library or something like that. But it's good to know that it's there. Speaking of libraries, the next thing on our layer cake I want to talk to you about is the ICU, International Components for Unicode. Now, this originally is a set of C++ and Java libraries, which obviously isn't helpful for us as web developers, but it is one of the original wrappers of the CLDR data repository. But importantly, it defined a message format for writing resource strings. Now, you know how I mentioned that you can leave a template in your code and then point it to a string file? The ICU message format lets you do a little more than just strings with it. For example, you can template. So you can do welcome name, and then when you call that ID, you can pass in a value and it will get filled in. You can also specify the type of variable. So you can say there were an amount of people there. Count is a variable which you pass in, and number is a keyword that tells it what type of variable it is. So it'll know to do things like substitute commas for periods on the thousand separator, for example, based on what locale you pass. You can also specify options. So for example, you can pass a birthday variable, you can say it's a date, but then you can also, as an option, display it as a short date, which will display sort of as the 2 number month year date. Or, depending on the locale, it'll be a different order. You can also do selects. So for example, you can pass in a gender variable and it's like a switch statement almost. You can change up the text based on that. Some languages, especially Romance languages, have highly gendered nouns, even like tables and chairs and stuff. So this comes in handy. And you can also do count. So like if you have an inbox and you have like, 3 messages, or you're checking out on a flight and you have seats, you can change the text based on like the number of things, and that's called a plural. Now, how do you write string resources to optimize for internationalization? Use the ICU message format for starters. Write full sentences when possible. As developers, we're really used to not repeating ourselves, but in internationalization, it actually is important to repeat yourselves, because when you try to cut corners, it can break down the grammar structure of a specific language. So don't try to build sentences yourself in code. Don't try to do things like preposition plus verb plus adjective, because that quickly breaks down in another language. And then use complex arguments like the select or the plural as the outermost structure of a message. So let's look at an example. Let's say we have this sentence and we want to change it up depending on who's doing it. So we have a gender, and then we say it's a select statement. And let's say if they put in male, it's he, female, she, they. And he likes to dance the cha-cha in the moonlight. Now you'll notice that because we have the singular they, the grammar breaks down pretty quickly, because they likes is not grammatically sound. It should be they like. So this doesn't work. Now you'll say, it's fine, I'm a developer, I'll fix it. I'll just put in the verb within the things that change. So he likes, she likes, they like. This works, but it works in English. Once you switch to Spanish, French, whatever, the grammar won't let you change it in the order that you need to change it. So that's not going to work once we start translating. The correct way to do it is this. You put in the full sentence for each variation. And I know it's repeating yourself, and I know we hate that, but in internationalization, it's important because of the wide variety of languages and their grammar structures and their gendering, for example. So remember, always use full sentences, even if it feels wrong. Moving up on the cake, JavaScript Alert. This is where we start getting codey. JavaScript actually has an internationalization API, which when I wrote this talk, I was blown away by because I had no idea. It's also being worked on actively. You can look for ECMA 402 to see all the stuff that's proposed to make it better. Currently, it has a number format, a date-time format, and a collator. And you use it like this, and you can do this in your console on your browser already. You initialize a new intel number format or date-time format. The first parameter is a BCP47 locale. So in this first example, it's a number format for Japanese as spoken in Japan. The second parameter is options. So for example, this is going to be a number format, and you can say style it as currency, and then you can pass it the currency code. And then once that's created, you call dot format on it. So for example, in Japan, they don't really use minor units like pence. So your result will be a nice round number, even though your original number has minor units. You can also have more options for date-time formats like weekday, years, months, and dates. So that second example is a new date-time format for DE, which is German, as spoken in Germany. And then you call dot format on it. The problem is that you'll notice that you have to set up the options for each of these constructors. So it starts getting expensive quite quickly and really sort of like messy to administer if you're doing it sort of in vanilla JavaScript. There's also some browsers that don't support it, or some older browsers, so make sure to polyfill it if you are internationalizing. And it's also still a work in progress in JavaScript. So if you are interested, you can Google the TC39 proposal or the internationalization working group if that's something that you're interested in. But I won't talk about. Now, I'm going to talk about a library. Disclaimer, there are other libraries. This is just one I've used. People get mad at me and they're like, why didn't you use my library? They're all good. This is the one I'm familiar with. So there's this library called FormatJS. It's open source. It's run by Yahoo originally, and it has bindings for React, Ember, Handlebars, and Dust. It also has some core modules that help you format messages, which is like a translation thing. And it has, I think, info about polyfills. I'm not too sure. So apologies if you don't read React. Imagine it's like HTML on crack. But this is an example of how you would use FormatJS with React bindings. Let's say we have a button and we can import a formatted message component, which is basically you format strings with, like translations. You give it an ID, which will point to your string resource file. You can give it a default message in case that string is not available in your resource file. And then you can pass it in a value if your resource file has a template that you need to fill in. So for example, let's say this is a button, sign in as name, and then you can pass in the name dynamically. And this will just change once you change the resource file. So it makes it really flexible for you to translate your site. This is what that would look like on the string resource file. So for example, this is a file for Spanish. So you'll notice in that first example that we're using the same ID that we used here, button.sign and .primary, and that'll just point to that first entry, but the content will be in Spanish, and it will have a variable which we passed in from the component. So that'll get filled in. And you can do one of these files for every language. You can also use just vanilla JavaScript. You don't have to use React. That was just an example. You can also import the Intel package from FormatJS and just call .format message and pass an object with all the same options, ID, default message, value, etc. Now, that is the end of our layer cake, which is the building blocks of internationalization on the web. We have Unicode, we have the BCP47 tags, we have CLDR, which is the Common Locale Data Repository, which is super cool. We have the ICU, the Internationalization API in JavaScript, and then the FormatJS libraries. Now, there's one more thing I wanted to talk to you about, which is that internationalization has a logistics problem. This is where it starts becoming not so trivial and not so easy. For example, imagine you build an app or a website or whatever, and then you get your strings translated by like a friend who's a translator, and then you deploy your site. Great, you're done. But once you're live, What happens if you want to add a feature? You have to get your strings for the new feature translated too. So what if you have multiple languages and maybe 2 of them come back, but you're still waiting for a third one? Do you wait for the third one? Do you deploy your site with only 2 languages? But what happens to the new feature in the third language? And then in the meantime, while you're dealing with that, what if someone on your team or maybe you add a different feature? But then that's all done. That came back faster. Maybe it was less text. And that's ready to deploy. Do you deploy it knowing that maybe some of the languages? And this sort of snowballs. What if you have to change the existing features? Tags. So there's this concept of continuous localization, which is a way of automatically seamlessly gathering new source material, publishing it for translation, getting the new translations, and integrating them back into the product. Now, this is often, at least I've seen it done a lot as a software as a service. There's a lot of companies that will help you do that. We used one at an old job where you could hook it into your GitHub flow and it would commit translations back into your pull request. But given that, internationalization is much easier to integrate into your project early. That way you can get developers on board, you can get your translators on board, whether it's like an external company or an in-house situation. It's a lot easier to integrate early. Let me give you an example of why this is important. It's not just the logistics, it's also stuff like design and UI. So I used to work at Trainline, which sells train tickets all over Europe. Now, while I was working there, we decided we were going to add a bunch more languages and a bunch more currencies, which was great. So we had, for example, when you select your train, we would let you know that we've defaulted your selection to a specific ticket. We had a little pop-up box at the top. Now, when we tried to translate that, we ran into this issue where it was overflowing and we weren't ready. Now, this was a quick fix, right? We went into the CSS, we noticed that it had a fixed height, we removed it, boom, German fits. Great. Now, we used to also have this grid where the columns were train times and the rows were types of tickets. You'll notice there was information in there, for example, limited availability, which is already kind of pushing against the space of each grid cell. Then we had to translate it, both the currency, because you'll notice we have a pound sign here. Let's say we wanted to sell a ticket in French, but in Swedish krona. You'll notice first that the currency symbol is gone, doesn't fit. You'll also notice that the limited availability text has grown and is now really stretching into that space. It's not fully respecting the boundaries. And this was a scalability issue, and it took a team weeks, maybe even months, to turn this into this as a results page. Now you'll notice we got the currency symbol back. The limited availability text now has room to breathe. If there's any other information we needed to add, there was a little more room. But all of this could have been avoided if the original had been designed with internationalization in mind. So that's just a cautionary tale for you to start early. So what have we learned? 1, internationalization is part of accessibility. Internationalize all the things. 2, it's supported by a bunch of standards that helps do it right. So become familiar with the standards, know what to Google. It helps make sure you are consistent. Try to start early if you can, for design especially. Always, always, always let your user pick their own locale. If there's one thing, it's that. And as a bonus tip from me to you, German is a great first test language because the words are super long and it'll definitely break your site if you haven't planned for it. Thank you so much. I have been Ellie. Find me on Twitter if you have any questions. And thanks for listening.